ICUJP is thrilled to be joined once again by Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is a longtime ally of ICUJP. I would say and speculate it's because our motto is that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. We're thrilled to have Medea with us today at our holiday gathering because toward the end of her remarks and our conversation together, she'll be discussing how Code Pink and other human rights groups across the world are calling for a Christmas truce in Ukraine. And she will explain the historical origins of the Christmas truce and why it's so important this year. Medea and her colleague Nicholas J.S. Davies have written an extraordinary book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, published by OR Books. Can you imagine this was put into press over 180 pages in short order? It is easily the best primer on the history of Ukraine, its politics, its place in the world scene, and the role of the United States, Russia, and other countries leading up to this barbaric war that's taking place and killing so many. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today. I'm proud to count Medea as a partner in this work. She is co-founder of Code Pink and the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange. She's the author of Drone Warfare, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the US-Saudi Connection, and the book Inside Iran. In 2012, she was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation's Peace Prize. She's also the recipient of the 2014 Gandhi Peace Award and the 2010 Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I do want to note, so that it's recorded here, that her co-author of this book is Nicholas J.S. Davies. He's the author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. And Nicholas has written extensively for Huffington Post, Alternet, Consortium News, Common Dreams, Salon, and the Progressive and Foreign Policy in Focus. It is a public service that this book is available now. I have read it and studied it, and it's it's indispensable. No one can offer opinions on Ukraine without reading this book, and I mean by that every member of Congress, the Senate, the Foreign Service, and people around the world. Code Pink has produced an 18-minute video on the war in Ukraine and the struggle for peace. Because so many of you are joining us on the telephone today, and others will see this event when it's recorded and posted, that we are putting a link to the video in the chat, and I'm going to attempt to tell people on the phone and on this recording that you can go to www.codepink.org/Ukraine book video, all one word. So the end of that is codepink.org/Ukraine book video to see a really extraordinary 18-minute video that furnishes so much information on this war. and the struggle to end it and to bring peace to that war-torn country. So please consider that part of your experience today. Take some time for us later today and whenever anyone is seeing this recording to go and watch that video. But I do want to turn to Medea. I'm going to take the liberty, Medea, of having you included in our circle by asking you as an opening, what has given you joy this year?
Well, thank you. And first, let me apologize for the background music. I hope it's not too distracting. I'm in a hotel lobby. Can you hear me okay? People can
Yes,
shake
it's
their
fine.
heads. Yeah. And Steve, it does seem like somebody else is not on mute. So I wonder if we could say that once again. So what's given me joy is not only family, new grandchild, and the joy of hanging out with them, but also seeing the progressives come into power in Latin America. And that's a constant joy for me because we see so many negative things around the world and so much backward movement in terms of people having access to government resources, that when we look in Latin America, and especially the election of Lula in Brazil, is a great joy to me because I see not only that as being positive for the people of Latin America, but it helps to change the face of geopolitics in the world and move us closer to a more multipolar world. So that gives me joy. Thank you, Steve.
Without the video for everybody, just give us the lay of the land as far as you and Code Pink see the setting in which the war in Ukraine is raging. And then I'll have some follow-up questions myself, and then we will open it up for questions for the whole group.
Well, it's hard to do a holiday party and have Ukraine be the subject because it's so awful. I think it's important to just all recognize how much the people of Ukraine is suffering, how much this war has led to death, destruction. And now in the cold winter, I'm in New York City where it's quite cold and raining. And I think about the people in Ukraine, not only the soldiers from both sides who are being called upon to fight during a cold winter, but the civilians, many of whom have fled the country, but many of whom are still in the country and facing the cold without adequate heat, energy, and water because of the most recent strategy of the Russians to destroy the infrastructure of the country. So let's keep them in our hearts as we talk about this issue and not have anything that I say be construed as justifying the Russian invasion and belittling the suffering and the brutality of this war. So that said, the main reason that we wrote the book was to give people an understanding that wars don't just fall from the sky. They're not something that just happens from one day to the next. They are in a context. And in this case, the context is one that's been brewing for decades now, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's important to go back to that time, 1991, when the agreement was made between the US with Gorbachev as the head at that point to say we're not going to expand NATO. Now, I know there's many people who have belittled that and said, well, it wasn't a treaty and NATO is not threatening Ukraine. I would really object to that because the existence of hostile alliance that is surrounding Russia certainly has been conceived by people in Russia, including in the leadership, as a threat. And I also object to people who say that NATO is a defensive alliance, because it is an offensive, dangerous military alliance that is taken part with the United States in offensive actions far from its borders, including in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. Iraq, it didn't start out joining in, but it did after the fact. And so we have the refusal of the United States to abide by its commitment to not move, quote, 1 inch eastward towards Russia by expanding NATO to not only move eastward, but to incorporate former nations that were part of the Soviet Union. In addition to that, I think you have to look at the US bases that are in Europe and the 5 countries where the US has put nuclear weapons. So the context of a hostile military alliance that should have dissolved at the time when the Soviet Union was dissolved, when its NATO's counterpart, the Warsaw Pact, was dissolved. Not only, I feel, should NATO have not expanded, it should have disbanded, because there is no reason that the US should be so involved in an alliance that is really meant to protect Europe. And Europe needed, and to this now I think is more obvious than ever, its own security infrastructure that is not determined or led by the United States. So that's one main point that I think is important for us to recognize. And the other, Steve, that we go into great detail in the book is about the incredible interference of the United States into the internal affairs of Ukraine. And, you know, we hear a lot of complaining about Russian interference in our elections. In fact, that was given by many Democrats as a reason for Hillary Clinton losing that election. But when you look at US interference in Ukraine, it's quite remarkable. It's not a side issue, it's a central issue. And we are lucky that we have the recording by the woman who was the Assistant Secretary of State at that time, Victoria Nuland, with the US ambassador to Ukraine, that actually laid out in their conversation the US machinations to get who they wanted in as the head of Ukraine at the time of the uprising in Maidan in 2014. But we don't know the full extent of US involvement in that, turning a uprising that was a popular one against a corrupt president into one that was put into place a US and Western supported government. And in that Victoria Nuland recording, we not only have her saying who the US wanted to be the head of Ukraine, but we also have pictures of Victoria Nuland herself out on the street with the Maidan protesters giving out cookies and sandwiches. I say this because I'd like people to imagine what happened in January 6th in our country when there was an uprising and people wanted to storm the US Capitol. These Republican, what I would call a mob. Imagine if there was a Russian official who went out into that crowd, handing out goodies and telling people, you know, move forward and overthrow your government, and we are right here to back you. It's pretty inconceivable that a Russian official would ever do that in the United States. But that's precisely what the US was doing in the case of the Maidan uprising in 2014. So these are just 2 examples of incredible US and NATO interference in the internal affairs of that country and in trying to engineer the geopolitics in that region. And those are two examples that help to set the stage for the Russians feeling this level of insecurity that again does not justify their invasion, but helps to explain it.
Medea, you have 2 chapters in your book, and we have the time today to dig deeper into the history of this conflict than I think any of the networks and news shows and pundits have ever offered the American people the kind of history that your book does. You've got a chapter on how 2014 set the stage for war, and then the success and failure of Minsk II. As briefly as possible, but not holding back from any detail that you think you should share with us. Expand on what your intent is in those parts of your book.
Well, we want to explain in great detail how a popular nonviolent uprising turned into a violent one. And we also want to explain how the Ukrainians and the Russians, with the help of Germany and France and the Security Council of the United Nations, it negotiated an agreement. After the uprising, the putting in of a new head of state who was pro-US and anti-Russian, the republics in the Donbass, who have a majority of ethnic Russians there, they broke away from the main government. And this created a civil war in which many thousands of people were being killed. The Minsk agreements was a way to try to stop that conflict. And that agreement came into power in 2015 with monitors from the European countries, many of them. And the presence of those monitors was very helpful in trying to reduce the conflict. Yet there was a political part of the agreement, which was supposed to be a meeting between the head of state of Ukraine and the breakaway republics, as well as a change in the constitution to give autonomy to those breakaway republics within the framework of still staying in Ukraine. And that never happened, because as soon as the leaders of Ukraine tried to implement that, they were opposed by the right-wing elements in Ukraine who said, no way, we will not let that happen. And if indeed you try to do that, you will find yourself hanging from a tree, is what they said to Zelensky. But something recent just happened that I want to bring into this picture, is that after the Minsk agreements were signed, instead of the Western countries pushing Ukraine to implement the political part of that agreement, giving them autonomy to those regions, what did the US and the Western countries do? They started flooding Ukraine with weapons. Originally, it was Obama in power, and he said, well, we're just giving non-lethal weapons. And then Trump came in and said, no, what the heck, we're going to go with the lethal weapons, and started training Ukrainians, 10,000 every year, to beef up their military. Just this week, there was an interview with Angela Merkel, the former head of Germany, who said the Minsk agreements was actually a time to buy time for Ukraine and buy time to build itself up militarily. What she said is that there was never an intention to actually go ahead with that peace agreement. And she said, how could Russia ever trust the West to negotiate when it refused to implement the peace agreement that it signed? Now, this is something very incredible that she has said. and that Putin responded to and said, yeah, there's like zero trust with the West right now. But something that we should reflect on when we see a past agreement signed in 2015 by Russia, Ukraine, and the Germany, France, and the Security Council, that now we hear from the head of Germany that it was never intended to actually be complied with. And so for the last 8 years, it has been used as a quote excuse to build up the Ukrainian military. And here we are today. So this is a new piece of information that is important to think about when we wonder why there is, as Angela Merkel said, so little trust on the part of the Russian government.
One thing I learned so much about from reading your book is the rise of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Many of us rolled our eyes when Putin justified his war by cleansing Ukraine of Nazis, and adopting your approach without excusing him. It is important, especially in a global sense, to understand the rise in Nazism and white supremacy around the world. Just tell us the nature and why openings were given through the period you're discussing for far-right and neo-Nazi parties and armed militias to rise into influence in Ukraine.
Well, as we explain in the book, it's important to recognize the role of neo-Nazis. This is something the US government refuses to do. And while they have not been a significant factor on the political scene in recent years, they got a very small percentage of the votes. They have been a very significant factor in creating the paramilitaries that were fighting in the Donbass and refused to stop fighting once that Minsk agreement was signed. They have an outsized influence because they are armed, and they, in the United States, the recognition of the neo-Nazis in our Congress led to John Conyers, the congressman previously, who got a piece of legislation passed that the US could not provide any support to these neo-Nazi groups. And that was recently taken up again by another congressperson, Ro Khanna. The problem with that is now the neo-Nazi elements have been incorporated into the National Army. And it's impossible now with all of the weapons that we are sending there to say that the Azov battalion, for example, would not be able to get those weapons because they are one and the same now as the whole Ukrainian military. This should give us great pause to think of how we are helping to arm these elements, and also the question about where all these weapons are going. There was a piece done by CBS that said that perhaps as much as 70% of these weapons were not reaching the front lines where they were intended to go, and many of them were ending up on the black market. This was such a shocking report that CBS was forced to take it off the air because it didn't go along with the narrative that the US government and the mainstream media wanted. But when you look at the past where US weapons have ended up and US invasions having helped create groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we do have to question how we are supporting neo-Nazi groups around the country, around the world, who have who have gone to Ukraine to take part in this struggle. And also, we are hearing from faraway places like the president of Nigeria, who recently said that these weapons are ending up in the hands of what he called terrorist groups in his own country. So it is very disturbing to know as US taxpayers that these weapons are ending up in the hands of people who are creating havoc in other places around the world.
You devote an entire chapter headed Information Warfare. Expand on what's been happening in terms of the public's ability to understand what's going on in Ukraine from three perspectives: the censorship in Ukraine, the censorship in Russia, and the censorship in the United States.
There's tremendous censorship in Russia, and the government wants people to think this is not even a war. It's a, quote, special military operation. But there are millions of Russians who are able to get more accurate information. And it means that the level of opposition to this war in Russia has been increasing every day, especially with all of the soldiers who've been killed and people questioning for what cause. When the Russian government called up 300,000 more reservists, it was a time when hundreds of thousands of young men fled the country. And they are part of a movement globally that is trying to reach more of the Russian population to increase the opposition towards this war. And I think the government is starting to feel that opposition. In Ukraine, there is tremendous censorship as well. And while there is a lot of nationalist fervor to try to recover all of their territory in Ukraine, the opinion polls have shown that the increasing call for negotiations is coming precisely from those areas of Ukraine that are suffering the most from the conflict, meaning the areas in the eastern part of the country, where in the western part of the country where there is relative peace, there is more of a call to fight to recover every inch of territory that the Russians have taken since 2014. Here in the United States, there is two things happening in terms of what the American public gets to hear. One is the fact that our media tends to sensationalize these issues and not give a very, certainly not give the kind of background that we've even been able to talk about here. And that in itself is a form of censorship. The fact that people with different opinions are not able to get on the mainstream networks. I have written a book, I've done a film. I can't get an op-ed in a major US paper. People like Jeffrey Sachs, who you might have heard of, who has been an expert on these issues for decades, in fact, an advisor to both the governments of Russia and Ukraine, said that he can't get an op-ed in a major US paper. He was only able to get once on US television. It was Bloomberg News. And as soon as they asked him who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, which were the pipelines that was taking gas from Russia to Europe, and he said that he thought it was the United States that blew that up. He was immediately chastised and say, "How could you say that, Jeffrey?" And then the interview was cut short and he hasn't been on TV again. So take that one example of a pipeline that was reported in the US press that it was the Russians who blew that up, whereas there's like zero motive for the Russians to have blown up their own pipeline and plenty of motive for US to have done that, because US both in the Congress and in the White House, was opposed to building of that pipeline from the beginning. And we have the press conference that President Biden did with the head of Germany, where he said, if Russia invades, that pipeline will be gone. And one of the reporters said, what do you mean? And Biden just said, that pipeline will not function. So there is, and after it was blown up, US energy companies are now increasing their production and their export of energy to Europe to take advantage of not only the blowing up of the pipeline, but the sanctions on Russian energy, and making a lot of money from it, so much so that there are Europeans who are complaining about the war profiteering of US companies. So this, Steve, is just to say, give an example of how we can't have a decent conversation of something like the blowing up of this pipeline. And I want to give one other important point, which is to say that the US media gives the impression that the Ukrainians are winning this war. Every time there is an advance, and there have been very successful advances by Ukraine to try to take back territory, they have been given to the US public in the light that Ukraine is able to win this war, meaning it can get back every inch of the Donbass and Crimea. Yet we have people in the Pentagon who basically know this is not true. This is just not going to happen. And if indeed there is an effort to try to get back Crimea, this is increasing the possibility that Russia would use a nuclear weapon. And so it is very dangerous, the kind of reporting that we are getting in the mainstream press, and the refusal of the mainstream press to have discussions on some of these very critical issues that opponents would put forth if they were given the airtime or the opportunity to write op-eds in places like the Washington Post and the New York Times.
You contrast the coverage of the refugees from Ukraine, who are largely white European refugees, both in how they've been treated in countries to which they have fled, and how the press has covered them, in contrast to refugees of other wars, particularly wars fomented and led by the United States. Tell us more about that perspective.
Well, yes, in many ways, we say that the example of how the refugees from Ukraine were treated, and let me say the white refugees, because it wasn't the case of people of color in Ukraine, the way that they were treated is the way that all refugees should be treated. They were welcomed, they were provided with transportation, they were welcomed with open arms when they got to the borders, like the border of Poland. They didn't even have to set up refugee camps. It's quite remarkable that when you have millions of people streaming out of a country, you don't have refugee camps. And why? Because local people were given money by governments to take in these refugees and to provide them with shelter and food and all kinds of help to integrate them. They were given the ability to have jobs where other refugees cannot work. And the amazing thing was that on the US-Mexico border, there was a separate line that was actually created for Ukrainian refugees, where they could be processed like that, taken into the country, given all the support that you could give to refugees. And this, of course, is in contrast to people who are waiting on that border for over a year. The way that Haitian refugees, for example, were being treated at the same time with horses and whips to push them back from the border. I mentioned that there were non-white Ukrainian refugees. Some of them were living in Ukraine, and some of them were students in Ukraine. Some of them were coming from African countries, from India, Some of them were not even let on the buses to get out of the country or on the trains. Some of them were beaten at the border. Some of them, when they crossed the border, were not even let into the hotels in Poland, for example, that were supposed to take in Ukrainians and were being given money by governments to take in the refugees. And African governments had to send in planes to take out their refugees because they were being so mistreated. So the examples of racism are just incredible. We even have in the book comments on television that said these refugees look just like us, meaning the white refugees. They could be your neighbors. And it was, they were portrayed in that way to increase the level of sympathy that people would have towards these refugees that quote look just like us.
I'm so grateful you opened those remarks by saying this is how we should be treating refugees across the world of every country from which they flee, irrespective of their color, ethnicity, religion, or nationality. I want to read a passage from your book and ask you to comment on it. You say that in the case of Ukraine, there were certainly hundreds of examples of horrors perpetrated by the Russian invaders and similar allegations of atrocities against civilians and prisoners by Ukrainian troops. Indeed, every killing of a civilian was an abomination. Every bombing of a hospital or a school or a residential neighborhood was an atrocity. There was credible evidence of summary executions, rape, and torture carried out by Russian forces in Ukraine. These criminal acts should be investigated by independent authorities, unquote. What do you have in mind in terms of the aftermath of this conflict and the degree to which any war crimes and violations of international law should be held accountable?
Well, Steve, I was just at a dinner last night, a gathering of people who work on Afghanistan, and they said that the International Criminal Court was proceeding with its case against the Taliban. That was supposed to be an international investigation of not just the Taliban, but of course, US crimes. And the US is refusing to cooperate, and in fact threatened and sanctioned the judge and the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court when that court wanted to hold accountable all of those who committed crimes in Afghanistan, which of course would include the United States. So the world looks at this and says that these international places to get accountability, like the International Criminal Court, are not meant for the powerful. They're meant for the crimes committed by those who are less powerful. And of course, I think we should want to see accountability for the crimes committed in Ukraine. And as you mentioned, Steve, we talk about the crimes committed by the Ukrainians as well, like execution of prisoners of war, which is illegal. But the call from the United States and the Western countries is not to hold Ukrainians accountable, it's to hold the Russians accountable. And I think Russia should be held accountable, but it's in the context of such hypocrisy on the part of the United States on the West, when the US is never held accountable, whether it's what we did in Vietnam, what we did in Iraq, what we did in Afghanistan, in Libya. So until the US gets held accountable, I don't think it's going to be possible to hold Russia accountable, for example. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be some tribunal that will have the ability to hold everybody accountable in Ukraine. And it would be nice because people should be held accountable for war crimes. But let's remember to put it in the context of the biggest bully on the globe, which is the United States, never being held accountable for its crimes.
And you make the incisive point, and I'm quoting, one of the consequences of the impunity enjoyed by senior US officials in the Iraq and Afghan conflicts was that it encouraged Putin to believe that he too could get away with aggression and war crimes against Ukraine. We set tremendous examples by the American exceptionalism that is perpetuated constantly. I want to turn now to the resolution of this conflict. We are living through it, but that's the point of Code Pink's involvement, is to find a path forward. To begin with, why is the left in the West so divided over this conflict?
Well, one is the kind of media, the narrative that's being put out by the mainstream media. Another is that you have a Democrat in the White House. And when you have a Democrat in the White House, the progressives who would normally be with us in an anti-war stance, many of them are following along with the narrative coming out of the White House. So between the mainstream media and the administration, you are getting one narrative. Those who look deeper and dig deeper tend to see things a bit differently, and would take the position that my colleague Nicholas Davis and I will take. And then you have people, and I'm seeing Dave Clennan's comment in the chat, and there are people like Dave who are criticizing from, I guess I would say from the left, saying that Russia's invasion was justified. And I take exception with that because as an anti-war activist, I don't think any invasions of other people's territory are justified. And so you get criticism and divisions happening along the spectrum. And I think it's very hard for Americans when there is an anti-war movement that's easier to build up when there's a Republican in the White House and when it's US doing the invading, and it's more obvious that the US is the aggressor. In this case, with the Democrat in the White House, with Russia being the aggressor, it's very hard for people to figure out what's the right position to take and how should we then manifest that position.
Yes. So take a few minutes to lay out what Code Pink and your allies see as a path forward, beginning with a Christmas truce, a long-term ceasefire, negotiations, and some kind of resolution peacefully of this conflict.
Well, first, I think it's important to recognize that part of the US purpose right now is to, quote, weaken Russia. And this has been said explicitly by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. This means that there are people in the administration who are okay with seeing this war drag out for years and years and years. But who are the ones who are really going to suffer? The Ukrainians, and of course, us as taxpayers, because if this latest request from the White House of $37 billion goes through, we will have spent over $100 billion in less than a year on this war. So those of us it's a very interesting position right now where there are people in the Pentagon, like the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said this war won't be won on the battlefield. And yet the policies of the administration is to act as if this war will be won on the battlefield and just keep pouring more weapons in. If we take the position of this war cannot be won on the battlefield, then we must figure out how can we stop it as quickly as possible and move towards negotiations. And there, I think we have to think of who are our allies in the United States that we can use to start building up this anti-war sentiment. We're not strong enough to get thousands and thousands of people out on the street like we have been able to in the past. And so we have to do our job of educating people to recognize that the sooner this war moves from the battlefield to the negotiating table, the fewer people will be killed. And Steve, I'm not sure if you wanted me to move into the idea of who can we mobilize, or did you want me to talk more about what could happen at the negotiating table?
Let's start, because we do still have time, the nature at the negotiating table and addressing a question I know is on a lot of people's minds. Do negotiations reward Putin for a brutal and illegal invasion? So give us some sense of what you think should happen at the negotiating table, and then we'll move into the activist mode of how Code Pink, ICUJP, and others can support that process.
So I think one of the key issues is that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. Now, this is something that Zelensky himself recognized early on after the invasion, when there were negotiations taking place. And it was clear that a key issue of those negotiations was neutrality for Ukraine. And he went and spoke to the Ukrainian people, saying why that was going to have to be part of a compromise with Russia. And yet now, today, he has gone to a very different maximalist position, saying that he wants Ukraine to be fast-tracked into NATO. Well, if there is going to be a compromise, it's going to have to be that Ukraine be a neutral country, but to have the Ukrainian government agree to that, it's going to have to be backed up by powerful countries that are going to have to give security guarantees to Ukraine. Another issue is what happens to the contested regions, the Donbass and Crimea. When it comes to the Donbass, we did have a solution in the Minsk II agreement, and I think it's going to have to go to something like a Minsk III, which means that there will have to be a dividing line, and they will have to figure out where that dividing line is. And then there are going to have to be internationally supervised referendum, not the sham referendums that took place under occupation, under a war, but referendum where the people feel free to express their desires, whether it's to stay part of Ukraine, be autonomous within Ukraine, be independent, or be part of Russia. So that has to happen with, again, international supervision. The issue of Crimea, I think that Crimea is going to have to remain in hands of Russia, because I don't see Russia giving up that territory. It was part of Russia for 200 years. It's an important port and base for Russia. And the majority of people there are Russian speakers, ethnic Russians. So I think as part of that compromise, maybe it will be that this will be down the line, giving people a chance to have internationally supervised referendum there, but I don't see Russia agreeing to turn over Crimea. In other issues that would have to be determined are things that only the US and Russia can talk about, and that is security guarantees for Russia. You know, it's interesting, Steve, there was a press conference last week between Macron from France, who is on a state visit to Washington, and the press coverage was all seeming like Biden and Macron were on the same page, and it was all kind of a love fest. But really, behind the scenes and in a press conference that Macron held afterwards, he made it very clear that he understood, because he has been talking to Putin on a pretty regular basis, that there are legitimate security interests of Russia that have to be accounted for. And the US is going to have to talk to Russia about those legitimate security interests. It might be about bases that the US is building, like in Poland, 100 miles from Russia's border. It might be about the nuclear weapons that the US has in 5 different countries in Europe. It is also about the sanctions. What would Russia have to do to get those sanctions lifted? And the arms agreements that the US has pulled out of that had been negotiated with Russia previously, and either were allowed to expire or during Trump pulled out of them. And so these are issues that all have to be on the table, which means there need to be negotiations directly between Ukraine and Russia. And then separately, there need to be negotiations between Ukraine and the United States. I mean, between Russia and the United States.
Thank you. Before we turn to questions from our participants, and I hope everyone is thinking of any questions that Medea's talk has given rise to, let's talk about the Christmas truce, the history and the precedent for a Christmas truce, and then the ceasefire and what steps groups like ICUJP can take to support peace in Ukraine.
Well, first, let me just reiterate this issue of how dangerously close we are to a nuclear war. And this has been brought up very recently by one of the most hawkish people from the West, and that is Jan Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, who recently was asked what are his greatest fears, and implying a nuclear war, he said that this would spin out of control. And if it did, it could be horrific. We also have Biden at one point talking about nuclear Armageddon, and we will have the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in January coming out with its doomsday clock to say that we are closer to a nuclear war either than we have been since 1962 or that we have ever been. So let's keep that in mind when we're talking about the need for negotiations. And then, Steve, in terms of what you just asked, I think people who have seen the history of the 1914 truce during World War I, when there was a spontaneous coming together of the warring parties who left their trenches to go in the Christmas Eve to fraternize with the enemy. And it's so remarkable that we still are talking about it over 100 years later, when these young men on the battlefield started sharing meals together, started singing Christmas carols and playing soccer together. People didn't believe it until there was photographic evidence and there were eyewitness testimonies. And there have been documentaries and feature films about this remarkable time of the Christmas truce in 1914. And it warms people's hearts to think about the soldiers treating each other as full human beings. And this is why we at Code Pink, together with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the National Council of Elders, came together to use the spirit of the 1914 Christmas truce to call for one today. And at the same time, without knowing it, groups in Europe have been doing the same thing. The International Peace Bureau has called for Christmas truce. And when we put it out there, we thought, let's try to get 100 religious leaders and we have close to 1,000 in less than 2 weeks' time. So we're really just so excited about how many people from the religious community have come out. It includes people like Reverend Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. It includes people like Jesse Jackson, like folks from the belonging to the National Council of Churches. And because you are a faith-based group, we hope that you have put this out to your contacts and you all have signed on. And if you haven't, I'll put the link to the peaceinukraine.org website, or the where you could sign on to that. And let's get to over 1,000. Now, I don't think this Christmas truce is actually going to happen, but I think it's a great organizing tool that we can use after Christmas to keep building on that. And one of the most exciting things about this is that some of the people who have signed on, including Jim Wallace, for example, from Sojourners, are people who have contacts in the White House, who have been at prayer services in the White House, who were part of Biden's inauguration. And so they are taking this Christmas truce idea and the petition itself to the White House, where they've asked for a meeting. So once again, I'll put the link in, and there are 2 links. One is for faith-based leaders, and one is for everybody to sign on to. And let's keep that going for this holiday season. So I'll do that right now, Steve.
Yes, while you're doing that, ICUJP has endorsed Code Pink statement on Ukraine. We've endorsed the Christmas truce. We've pushed out the peaceinukraine.org website and others, and we hope everybody seeing and hearing this program today will continue to do that. I'm going to hope, instead of assuming that there will be no Christmas truce, that the world could rise up in this moment, and all of those who care about the lives of Ukrainians and soldiers of every country in Ukraine to cause that truce. If that does not take place, Medea, what are the next steps in calling for a long-term ceasefire next year? And then how can peace organizations support a negotiated settlement?
Well, one of the things I would say is positive is that we know there's great divisions in the Biden administration right now about this. You know, I've talked about the growing opposition within Russia, and I didn't mention in Europe, but there is tremendous opposition to this war in Europe. And unlike here, where it's been difficult to manifest that with rallies, there have been tens of thousands of people out in the street in countries all over Europe, most recently in Italy, where they're complaining about the tremendous inflation and connecting that to the war in Ukraine. So within the White House, we see that there are people in the Pentagon who are warning about where this might lead. And we see that there are divisions that I think we have to pick up on to push. Where we don't see enough anti-war activism or calls is in Congress. There were 57 Republicans who voted against the $40 billion for Ukraine. And those people, some of them have been saying they heard from their base, and their base is saying we have so many unmet needs here in the United States. Why are we sending all this money to Ukraine? On the Democrat side, we did have the 30 progressive caucus members who signed on to a letter calling for negotiations, but they were so intimidated by the backlash that they withdrew that letter within 24 hours. And only one of them, Congressman Ro Khanna, has been willing to stand by that letter and continue to call for negotiations. So we have a lot of work to do to get even the progressive Democrats to come out for negotiations. And I think we should think of that as our work as we go forward. to get them to recognize that that letter was actually the correct thing to do, that there are people in the White House who agree with that sentiment, and that they should either collectively or individually be calling for ceasefire and negotiations. So that's what we have to do in terms of Congress. There are calls for demonstrations. January 14th, Martin Luther King Day, there is a call for demonstrations. We also have webinars that we'll be doing on that day, linking Martin Luther King's call for fighting poverty, racism, and militarism. We at Cook Pink are going to be calling for global peace demonstrations on International Women's Day, March 8th. And at the peaceinukraine.org website, there are resources, flyers, all kinds of things that people can use to just do as things as simple as going out to farmers market and with a sign that says, let's talk about Ukraine, and get people discussing this issue. So there's all kinds of things that people can and should be doing to build up the call for ceasefire.
My final question before we turn to others, aren't there some natural allies in the progressive movement, environmentalists, unions, other sectors of the progressive community that would be natural allies in this call for peace in Ukraine?
Absolutely. You know, there are people questioning, should we make alliances with the people on the right? And that's a issue that we could certainly discuss because there is a lot of sentiment among some libertarians and conservatives against this war. But in the meantime, we haven't done our job getting our allies in the more progressive movement. For example, this war for environmentalists should be way, way up on their list of what they want to work on, because imagine all the environmental destruction going on in Ukraine with all these bombs and explosions. Imagine all of the environmental consequences of the incredible increase in weapon production. Imagine the environmental consequences if the Zaporizhia nuclear plant indeed explodes. The explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline let out the largest emission of methane gas ever recorded. And imagine the environmental destruction of this leading to a nuclear war. And then lastly, all of the money that we are spending is money that should be put into dealing with the environment, like we've seen the global South countries calling on us to do at that last COP27 meeting in Egypt. So this is an issue that the environmentalists, and I include ourselves as environmentalists, should be recognizing that there will never be the attention paid to the environment as long as this war continues. Labor movements, you brought up, Steve. You know, unfortunately, the labor movement in this country is quite weak, and it tends not to take on positions on issues like this. But when we look in Europe, we see the labor movements are actually leading a lot of the demonstrations because they know that working people are so affected by the inflation that is one of the consequences of this war. So we need to push the labor movement in this country to recognize that as well, and to be with us in not only calling for negotiations, but helping to lead some of the protests. And we are reaching out to some of the new labor movements that are more political, like the Amazon workers and the Starbucks union organizing, and they tend to put their issues in this larger context. So we have some possibilities there. And I think some of the more progressive locals, like we have in LA, would be willing to perhaps sign on to a call from labor organizers that this war is bad for working people all over the world.
Thank you, Medea. One of the strengths, in my opinion, of ICUJP is we've always made the links between so-called foreign wars and domestic conditions in this country, and the need for groups that see themselves as having only a domestic agenda to rise up and support our motto that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. I've got two electronically raised hands. I'll take those two. And if anyone on the phone who can't use that technology has a question, then I'll turn to you folks. But let me take Carol Francis and then John Crampner.
Medea, thank you. When you spoke at All Power Books about this issue, the thing that really stuck in my mind of where we should be organizing is those signers of those letters that withdrew the letter. And we need the names of them. We need to reach out to them and say, hey, you signed this, you've got to go back and re-sign it. And also, like I said, then we need to all call and lobby Rokana and tell them thank you. So is Code Pink putting out anything to allow us to do that? Like something that would go to all the signers and a separate one thanking Rokana?
Well, I think that's a great idea, and we can easily do that. So we can get a list of all the signers and put it up as a resource on the Peace in Ukraine website and an action idea like you're saying. So Carol Francis, thank you for that suggestion. And I do think that we could get some of those people, like Maxine Waters, you know, she should be coming out for a ceasefire. I was in the Bay Area and they're doing all kinds of rallies outside of Barbara Lee's office because she is, you know, somebody that we think of when we think of peacemakers. And yet, I hate to say it, but Marjorie Taylor Greene, the extreme right Republican, has said better things than Barbara Lee in terms of this war and the need for negotiations. So this is a time when we have to organize our peacemakers at the base to say, we don't care who's in the White House. This is not a partisan issue for us. War is too important an issue to be hostage to partisan politics. And let's get that list of 30, well, 29, because we don't have to lobby Rokana. We can just thank him and get them back on record calling for ceasefire.
Thank you. I want to tell people on the phone, if you hit *6, you can unmute, and then we'll know that you have a question. But let me turn to John Crampner next.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Medea. What I wanted to ask is, what's your best guess as to the number of internal and external refugees created by this war? And other than Poland, which countries are
we lost some of you, John, just then. But
I was going to say, well, it's a two-part question. One, what's her best guess as to the number of internal and external refugees? And then other than Poland, which countries are bearing the brunt of the external flood of refugees?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, the refugees are all over Europe. You know, I don't want to say this in a negative way, but for many of the Ukraine was a very poor country, and this has been a horrific way to be able to leave their countries, but a lot of them do want to come to the United States. And I did say how the Biden administration had created all these opportunities for Ukrainian refugees to come here, in contrast to the ability of other refugees to come here. But I also, because I mentioned I was at this meeting last night, dealing with Afghanistan, to just put it in the light of how difficult it has been for the Afghans who worked with the US military for 20 years to come to the United States. That being said, there are probably about 8 million refugees who have traveled to places all over Europe. Once you get into Europe, they can travel freely, so it's hard to know where they are. It looks like since this recent bombing by the Russians of the infrastructure, there's another 2 million refugees that are leaving. So it seems like it will be about 8 million refugees. Some of them, of the earlier refugees, did come back because many of them are in areas where there is not fighting. But now with the destruction of the infrastructure, made it so difficult. So I don't know, Poland still has by far the majority of those refugees. We should also say that a large number of refugees also went into Russia, and many of those were from Eastern Ukraine. So Russia is also dealing with probably close to 800,000 refugees.
Thank you. Michael Novak.
Yeah, hi, sorry I was late, so I might have missed some stuff, but I appreciated the start of those remarks, Medea, when you talked about the issue of refugees in the United States. And I think in relation to the war and the refugees, I think we do have to look at the question of white supremacy in terms of both how much focus there is in this one particular war as opposed to all the other wars that the U.S. is actually engaging in more directly than this one, and arming and Saudis in Yemen, and the attacks in Syria, and what's going on in Palestine, and also on the question of refugees, that they're deporting people to Haiti and elsewhere, and allowing refugees in from Ukraine. And I think the Europeans also were very selective. And in the earliest part, there was, in particular, there were people of African descent in Ukraine itself that were having trouble, getting refugee status. I just wanted to draw that out a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, you'll be happy to know Medea did cover that very explicitly, and it's worth reiterating. We're coming to the end of our time. Medea, you have some closing comments?
No, I just wanted to say, and one other thing about the refugees, many of them have also gone into places like Hungary, Romania, and in the case of Hungary, it's been causing problems because there is not such a warm welcome for those refugees. In terms of closing remarks, I'm counting on all of you as dear colleagues and people very close to this issue to help us educate people. I didn't write the book to make money. You don't make money on these books, but I hope that you'll get copy and give copies to your friends as well. People who were perhaps quite confused about this issue. We've made the video free and available so that people could have house parties, pass on the link to other people. As I said early on, this is a conflict where we have to do a lot of education. And then for those of us who are already convinced that the best thing for everyone is to end this war as quickly as possible, let's make a commitment in this holiday season that we're going to at least make a call to our members of Congress, and that includes the senators, and that I assume that through your organizations, there's more of an ability to do things collectively. So I look forward to working with all of you for the call for the holiday truce, and then the building up in the new year, so that we can do our job as people in this country to at least make sure that those who are calling for another endless, unwinnable war will hear loud and clearly from the base that this is just not acceptable.
Thank you, Medea. We're immensely grateful for the time you spent with us today. You are already a card-carrying member of ICUJP. Your book is a public service. David Swanson, a good friend to ICUJP and executive director of World Beyond War, says, give this book to anyone seeking the knowledge and wisdom needed to help end the violence in Ukraine. I couldn't have said it better. We support you, Medea. We hope that with your grandchild, you have some life-work balance, and we'll take a little time off in this holiday season to be with your family and friends. You've been tireless in this work. We need to keep you strong and healthy and vibrant the way that you've been for so many years. I'm giving fair warning to Dr. Ruby for a closing prayer at the end of our circle. This is when we bring people metaphorically together, hand to hand, as we used to do at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church. With more of you on screen and following this video recording, I will remind you that ICUJP on January 11, Wednesday at noon, will be gathering in front of the downtown Federal Building for our annual Close Guantanamo rally with an extraordinary roster of speakers, with a tableau of individuals in orange jumpsuits and black hoods. The event will be simulcast and live streamed at that time on January 11 at noon, and we hope you will all be able to support us. We have other announcements. Carol Francis?
Yes, I just want to say, for those of you who have friends that need to know about this, but they don't read, or because they're overwhelmed with other things they're reading, send them the link to Code Pink's video about this. It is excellent. It's a shorter way than reading the whole book, but it's like all the points that need to be made, as well as, of course, the link to this, but just the video is really extraordinary.
And in that vein, for those who are not seeing the chat, you can go to www.codepink.org/Ukraine book video, all one word, and watch that video. Michael?
I already bought copies of the book, went to the Medea's presentations. I did want to urge people to consider donating to a KPFK in this season. It's our end of the year fund drive and a fundraising campaign. We do air Code Pink on the radio and also anti-war radio. And we've increased the shows that are trying to take a pro-peace view. So kpfk.org. And this weekend, the Spanish language programmers are doing a festive re-encounter out in Montebello Saturday evening from 7. If you want to go online to kpfk.org, you can get tickets to that, $25, and become a member thereby.
Thank you.
We are doing the circle. I'll have something to say later.
I do want to open our circle to lifting up people we know in our families and friends and others who are struggling, who need a good word. And I will immediately turn to Michael Novick for that.
Yeah, I did want to lift up my friend and comrade, and he's been on this circle many times, Lawrence Reyes. He's currently hospitalized, he's in the ICU and not currently conscious, and they're treating him for various things resulting from his diabetes. And so please keep him in your thoughts. And I hope that he is able to recover. And I also wanted to lift up Greg Foisey, who is dealing with dialysis and doing well, but please keep him in mind as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rick?
Hi, I wanted to lift up Melvin Johnson, who planned on actually joining us this morning, but unfortunately he had to deal with some family issues. His wife, Erlene Anthony, passed away this week, and she's been very involved, and he as well, in drama stage Qumran. So he's planning on joining us the beginning of next year for a forum. So if he can keep his memory of his wife and his family in your prayers, that'd be great.
John Crampton.
Yes, I'd like to lift up my good friend David Drum, a longtime friend from one of my freelance writing groups. He's battling advanced stage skin cancer and can benefit by all the good wishes anyone wants to send his way.
Thank you, and we're doing that right now. Anyone else? Maggie?
Oh, you're on mute, Maggie.
I'm sorry. I'd like to lift up my friend Annie Goldstein. I've lifted her and her husband up, and her husband has died. And she's lost a lot of her body parts through cancer and is now on dialysis 3 days a week and still struggling just to finish up all the business that happens when a spouse dies after 50 years of marriage. So she needs a lot of support. Right now she's in dialysis at this moment, and I need the support to learn to be she couldn't be more opposite than I am politically, and we're just like totally, and yet we're friends for all this length of time, and to keep me from getting my ego involved with trying to prove that I'm right. and to sometimes just shut my mouth. I need to be lifted up too.
Thank you. All of us need to nurture those kinds of relationships for the sake of peace. Let's turn to Ruby to
Looks like Ruby.
Let's send us Ruby. Send us off.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, but now you're frozen.
I'm
Go right
outside
ahead.
in this wonderful earth that we have, that we're truly open. Yes, and regarding ICUJP and all the work, and Medea and Ukraine and all of the things, the young ones that are coming up, for their enlightenment and for their wisdom and just the growth that they have, that they're giving us, and for all of those that have been spoken. And when we say that they have been spoken, we're talking about those that are in the hurt because of releasing a loved one. We're talking about our friends that are healing. And we're talking about who we are. And I know right now that divine power is giving us strength that wherever we go, whoever we are and whatever we believe, we know the work is here for us. And this already is starting a better year. And as I know and accept this, I give it up in thanksgiving and prayer. And so it is. Ashe. Amen.
Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Medea Benjamin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will see you in 2 weeks on the 30th at the next Friday Forum. Have a peaceful and loving 2 weeks. The answer to my own question of what gives me joy this year is moving closer to Pete and Hank, my wonderful grandchildren, and the family that support him and love him up here in Sonoma County. So thank you, everybody. Spend time with people you love, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.